Hi, we'd like to extend our stay.
And upgrade.
Completely derail us because I know we will get into the episode in a second. But my class that meets in the evening, we were just talking about digital minimalism and how the digital age has impacted our generation's ability to do what is called deep work, which basically just means no distractions, focused, locked in work. And how social media specifically has sort of degraded our ability to just focus.
Digital minimalism is so my new era. The chapter in my life right now is digital minimalism. I am so just not interested. I'm oh yeah, there's a whole world out there that I'm literally not seeing because I've been stuck here. Go do something else. Anyways, hey residents. Welcome back to Hoteller 360. I'm Ari.
And I'm Lexi.
And today we are talking about getting our hands dirty. Lex, I wanted to ask you something before we dive in.
Okay.
So, when you think about the biggest environmental challenges we're facing right now, that being climate change, water scarcity, biodiversity collapse, etc., where does your mind go first? Energy? Does it go to transportation? Fast fashion? Where does your mind immediately go when you're thinking about environmental challenges or environmental crises?
All valid, all real, all on my mind, but today in particular, we are going somewhere that doesn't really get nearly enough airtime, and I think that is also my response to your question. So we're going underground. We're going into the soil, onto the farm, into the very systems that feed every single one of us every single day. Or at least should.
Should being the operative word.
Yeah.
And here's the thing. Agriculture is responsible for somewhere between 19 and 29% of global greenhouse gas emissions, depending, of course, on all that you include. It is one of the leading drivers of deforestation, water use, and biodiversity loss on the planet. And yet, most of us think about it maybe as much as we think about, I don't know, the postal system.
So basically, we only think about it when it's going wrong.
Exactly.
When it's dire.
Exactly. When you lose a parcel.
When I'm like, that thing that was supposed to get delivered 3 days ago, where is it?
Literally. I mean, the Italian postal system is a whole nother level of dysfunctional. So don't even get me started. But today, we're going to talk about how we got here. The rise of industrial agriculture, the things that it gave us, and the things that it costs us. We're going to talk about regenerative farming, what it actually is, where it comes from, and what it can realistically do. And we're going to get honest about the fact that farming practices alone are not going to fix everything. This is a much bigger conversation.
So, okay, before we get into the problems, let's make sure we're all talking about the same definition. Because when you hear the word agriculture, most people picture a farm, maybe some cows, maybe a tractor, and if you grew up in the Midwest, perhaps a horizon of endless corn. But agriculture is actually so much more. The USDA defines it as the science, art, and practice of cultivating soil, producing crops, and raising livestock but it also includes the preparation and marketing of those products. And it doesn't stop at food. Agriculture also provides most of the world's fabrics like cotton, wool, and leather, because that comes from cows, in case you missed it. And it also provides wood for construction, paper. It is, in a very real sense, the foundation of human civilization, sort of as we know it. The choices embedded in the agricultural system ripple out into the climate, into our water, into our bodies, as we discussed in the last episode, and into our communities, which is something that we will talk about a lot in the coming episodes, especially when we discuss things like equity and policy shifts.
So let's talk about the Green Revolution. And I want to be clear right up front, I am not here to villainize it wholesale because the truth is more complicated than that, as most things are. After World War II, the world was grappling with a very real, very urgent problem: hunger. Global population was exploding. The agricultural systems of the time couldn't keep up. So scientists, governments, and agribusinesses came together to do something genuinely remarkable. They engineered a massive increase in food production, new high-yield crop varieties, synthetic fertilizers, pesticides, mechanization on a scale never seen before. Irrigation systems that could water fields that had maybe never been farmed. And all of this worked. By some estimates, the Green Revolution saved over 1 billion people from famine. That is not nothing. But here's where the story gets complicated. The system that was built to solve the crisis of too little food was optimized for one thing and one thing only: yield. How much can we grow as fast as possible, as cheaply as possible?
In the following interview clip, we sat down with Zion Davidson and Cole Rainey, land stewards at Sage Stewart Farm. Zion is a chef, farmer, and food as medicine practitioner. Cole is a farmer, soil scientist, and artist with a PhD from the University of California, Berkeley in agroecology and sustainable agriculture. After telling us a bit about their background, they describe an incredible transformation, taking land once used for industrial scale mushroom production for the Campbell's cream of mushroom soup into turning it back into a thriving regenerative ecosystem. Zion lays out what industrial level production does to our land and the beauty of what comes from active restoration. It's a story of moving from monoculture to stewardship.
My name is Cole Rainey, and I'm a fifth generation Californian, both sides of my family. So my family's been here for a really long time. And it also means I'm the descendant of settlers and colonizers and early farmers in the state, mostly lemons and oranges. And so I hold that history with a really with a spirit of reparations and atonement and repair. And that's really a lot of the spirit with which I come to this work of working with land and working with seeds and working with my relatives, my loved ones, and with the more than human world to create beauty and create nourishment. Um, I came to this work as a city kid from Los Angeles who had never touched the soil or grown anything in my life, and it was an absolute revelation when I actually connected with the earth and realized that the earth has given us everything that we need. And um, so I've got the fervor of a convert, if you will, in that I grew up very much a city kid. But yeah, similar path to Zion, it was through my connection with Buddhism and spirituality and spiritual traditions that I lived on a farm and came to fall in love with working with the soil and have followed that in many different ways since then, including getting a PhD in environmental science at UC Berkeley, um, where my focus was on soil and agroecology and um, social movements that support the massification and the ennoblement of our movements for food sovereignty and for the nobility of peoples as they struggle for their right to grow their own food and determine their futures.
My name is Zion Davidson. I was studying Buddhism for a few years after college and kind of got the feeling that I wanted to learn how to grow my own food. And so, yeah, I was getting interested in I knew I wanted to grow my own food. And the only person I knew who was doing that was Cole and a couple of other friends who were living in Oakland at the time at an urban farm. So I moved there to join them. It's called Canticle Farm, this beautiful community where Cole still lives in the middle of East Oakland. And yeah, and so I was there. I was getting like this new experience of growing food and on a very small scale at this urban farm, and also cooking big community meals. And that was a big opening for me of just working with many different types of produce and cooking large meals and large gatherings, which was a really new and fun experience. And through being involved in that community, I got connected to a small farming community that's based in the Sierra foothills, not far from Yosemite. And there they were and still are involved in this really beautiful sort of small scale intensive regenerative project of basically transforming what was desertified land into a food forest. And so I was there for a few years and really involved and amazed at how much the human being has the potential to transform a landscape and to make it, to improve it, to bring life back to it. And it was really there, actually, when I was really starting to feel on an even more deep and profound level the way that food impacts our body and our spirit as well, actually. So that was really a big transformative experience for me. It was like being really connected to the food and to the land in that way. And so um, that chapter closed and a new one opened up here, this beautiful site that I was describing to you earlier, called the Mushroom Farm. And so I was doing that here for a few years, where these fields were pretty much devoted to the production of a beautiful diversity of seeds. We weren't farming for vegetables; we were farming to produce the seeds that we would then distribute to farmers. And so I spent a couple years here doing that. Through that, the sort of vision and intention of the project started to evolve a little bit, where we sort of began kind of going in the direction of more of an educational farm, where the emphasis was less on the production of seed for sale and more on the cultivation of a garden that could facilitate transformative educational experiences and also produce beautiful food, a learning and living laboratory for regenerative practice. We are now at a place that's transitioning and transforming a bit, where we're actually kind of getting back into a vegetable production, and beginning to look to having it both be sort of an educational farm and also a production farm. So when I first saw this land, I saw the great paradox of our time, which is kind of living in the wake of a post-industrial apocalypse, really. This used to be where the Campbell's Soup Company made all of its mushrooms for its cream of mushroom cremini soup, and they were producing tons of mushrooms here, like 100,000 pounds a week, and they were doing that from like the early 70s through the early 90s, and when they moved the operation away and left a pretty serious mess here. They do what many companies do at that scale, which is as soon as they're done with something, they don't really think about their impact. They just kind of pack up and go because the money is taking them out somewhere else. But they left a lot of trash here and a lot of waste and garbage. And so when I first came, I saw a place that holds that story very evidently, with these like kind of dilapidated buildings and these like edifices of the mega industrial corporate capitalism, simultaneously with this incredible bounty of land and this incredible vibrance of a place, which, um, despite all of that, has retained a beauty and an integrity and a power in the land itself that was captivating to me. And I felt its great healing nature.
When yield is your only metric, certain choices start to look very attractive.
Such as monoculture. One plant, one crop. That's going to be things like corn, soy, wheat. Picture it across thousands of acres, year after year. It's efficient, it's easy to mechanize, it's predictable, but the problem is that nature didn't evolve to work that way. Natural ecosystems are diverse, they're layered, they are interdependent, not independent. So if you rip all of that out and replace it with a single species, you create a system that is extraordinarily vulnerable to things like pests, disease, weather, and soil depletion.
That's what leads to needing things like synthetic inputs to compensate for what monoculture strips from the soil. You pour in synthetic fertilizers to keep pests at bay without the natural predators that a diverse ecosystem would naturally provide. You spray pesticides and herbicides. In the short term, these chemicals do work, but they accumulate. They leach into groundwater. They kill off the microbial life in soil that makes it fertile in the first place. And the pests adapt. Newsflash. Which means you need more inputs over time. It's a treadmill that's very hard to step off.
Right, and the trifecta to all of this is consolidation. As mechanization made large-scale farming more efficient, the economic pressure to go bigger and bigger grew more intense. So things like small family farms, the ones that had sustained the communities in these areas for generations, got swallowed up. That's actually something that we talked about in our book review of What If We Get It Right by Dr. Elizabeth Johnson. And there is an entire section that we will be highlighting in our equity episode, which talks about how the consolidation of all of this has impacted small farmholds.
And here's something that really gets me. In the US, the federal crop insurance program, which is supposed to be a safety net for farmers, actually rewards farms with the highest yields. Not the healthiest soil, not the most sustainable practices, not the most nutrient-dense food, but the highest yields. The system is structurally designed to keep farmers on that treadmill. Here is Grace Johnson, an urban farmer and educator, to explain what happens when smallholder farms get bought out by big agriculture.
My name's Grace Johnson. I grew up in Windsor, California, in Sonoma County. It's super beautiful here. The food systems are really developed, and I feel really lucky about that. And I grew up in a family that practiced this thing called subsistence agriculture, and that's basically growing food with the seasons to eat for yourself as much as, humanly possible. And I was a part of that process from a really young age, and I learned a lot of things that a lot of my peers didn't know because they just simply weren't exposed to it. And when it came time to apply to colleges, I was like, I mean, I can just further my education in this and see if I can make actual changes in the systems. And I ate school lunches and I participated in community sports and groups, and the food there was very different from the food that I grew up eating. And I'm not here to provide this moral judgment as to what food is good or what food is bad, but I do know what foods make me feel a little bit better and what foods don't make me feel as good. And I think that's a disconnect that shouldn't be this privileged point of access or something that does divide people. Food should bring people together, is kind of my philosophy. And so having access to better food is ultimately the goal of my going to college and getting a degree in sustainable agriculture and food systems from UC Davis and focusing on this relationship between food and society.
Um, so on one of our first introductory calls, you had mentioned concerns about big agriculture buying out small family farms, specifically in Minnesota, and issues with soybeans and Monsanto. So, from your perspective, what are we losing when small farms disappear?
Oh, it's such a good question. It's, I think one of the biggest things that are missed out is community trust. Like, on top of that access and that localization and knowing where your food comes from and maybe being friends with the farmers and being able to visit the farm, whatever it is, I think the biggest thing you lose out on is community trust because those small farmers are a part of the community. And when condense and move on to a bigger operation because they're promising higher yields, they're making all these promises that sound great on paper, you are missing out on that connection. You're removing yourself from that connection in pursuit of feeding the world and buzzword and promise. And we can kind of look to Europe in some senses where the farms in Europe are on average like 35 acres, like 30 to 40 acres. In America, that's close to 500, which is insane. That's an average, meaning there's some that are way smaller and some that are way bigger. 500 acres, I can't even like imagine that if I'm being so for real. Like I'm really bad at like visualizing bigger numbers than like 10.
Is that not like the state of Nevada? Like, what the hell? Like
No,
that is
really.
a massive amount. That is like all of Area 51, like probably. Jesus Christ. A conspiracy.
No, no, seriously. So you like put that into perspective and you're just like, why why do we have to first of all, why do we have to streamline everything? Why does everything have to be this whole like and there's pros and cons to that. You can have a lot more regulation in a bigger context and have just a lot more efficiency, whatnot. But we are so disconnected from our food in America versus Europe. Like, I'm sure you can speak to that, Ari. And it's our food quality is also just so bad when it's just like we're trying to just get the same monoculture, the same thing, and monocultures exist everywhere. It's just kind of what we have to do sometimes, and there's better ways to, improve soil health during all of that. But ultimately, that disconnect from community, I think, is the biggest kind of horrible thing to come from like basically making small farms go bankrupt, and you're ruining people's livelihoods as well. And it's there's so many things that when things change, so many things in the world that when change happens, we're always going to be met with resistance. And I think that's the biggest kind of conversational piece in talking about regenerative ag is getting farmers to change requires the incentive to change. And what is that incentive? Like you have to make all these promises, and sometimes those promises aren't real, and it goes both ways. From going from small to commercial, from going commercial to regenerative, like there's always going to be pros and cons to all of this, and ultimately it's up to the general public's knowledge and policymakers to be able to make a good case. And hopefully it's the case that does the best for the environment. Shout out Hotel Earth. But truly, we just have to do better, man. We just have to do better.
So we ended up here. A food system capable of producing staggering quantities of calories that simultaneously degrades the very land it depends on, concentrates power in fewer and fewer hands, and has left millions of people, particularly in lower income communities as usual, without reliable access to nutritious food. Well, that's the exact paradox of industrial agriculture. It solved one version of the hunger problem. One version. We still are dealing with a hunger problem, while quietly creating several others. Tucker Garrison, who we briefly mentioned in the last episode, runs Imlakesh Organics and has spent years thinking about food systems at a global scale, put the paradigm shift we need really elegantly when we talk to him.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me on. I'm excited to dive deep with you guys. My name's Tucker Garrison. I am the co-founder of Imlakesh Organics. And I guess you guys invited me here because I've spent the last 13, 14 years really deeply engaged in regenerative agriculture and global sourcing around the world from small-scale farmers. To give you a little bit more of my background, which I won't get too deep into now, I've spent a lifetime in the ocean, and I'm a surfer and a free diver and scuba diver, and I think that was my first love of the ecology of this planet was the beaches and the coral reefs of our amazing, amazing, beautiful blue-green ball we have here, we get to live on, and that's kind of really where so much of what this springs from in terms of my work. And I've also had the immense privilege of getting to sit at the feet of many indigenous nations around the world who still remember the old ways. And hopefully I've gleaned at least a small bit of knowledge from them that has changed my perspective on the world. We have been, as humans, selecting seeds and selectively breeding plants for a very long time. Some of that has been unconscious and some of it has been conscious. So I think these are like some good level setting things we need to think about when we're talking about really the question, which I think is beyond agriculture, is how are we going to feed humanity? This is actually the question I would ask. How are we going to feed humanity within the sustainable bounds of what our planet can handle without degenerating it further? Which also means how are we eating in a way that is also nourishing and feeding all the other life that exists on this planet? To me, agriculture, like where agriculture sits in that is like kind of where we have the horse blinders on as a species, like this idea that that is the only possible way we can feed our planet. Let's talk about where we are for a second, which is that in this moment, the what I want to call like the mainstream paradigm of industrial agriculture. And one of the other things I'd encourage us to use in our language is we need to move away from the idea that there's conventional agriculture and organic agriculture, right? Conventional meaning normal. There's nothing normal about what's happening in conventional agriculture. It's 100 years old, 120 years old, and it's a highly abnormal way of producing food. So I will refer to it as industrial agriculture or petrochemical agriculture, right? So if we imagine like what does this system look like? And again, I'm oversimplifying. Industrial agriculture and this kind of hyper masculine approach to agriculture is all about controlling as many variables as possible. So what do I mean by that? Imagine a 10,000 acre field that's perfectly flat, full of genetically modified corn, where there's not a single weed, there's not a single plant, there's not a single insect, that the entirety of all of that corn is growing within 1 inch of height of every other grain of corn in that field. Right? There's no real soil. It's like there's like a sponge we call earth, but actually we're dumping industrial nitrogen fertilizer from far away outside inputs onto that land, then genetically modifying it so that it doesn't die when you spray herbicides on it, which kill plants. And then you take Roundup, right? And like what Bayer and Monsanto and all these companies are doing and spraying those things on the land. Now, of course, all of that, when it rains or when they irrigate it, it runs off into the waterways, right? So they know there's a connection beyond those 10,000 acres, but they want to avoid the idea that that's happening, right? And they know that all the things that they're doing are reliant on outside inputs that are coming from far away in order to make that happen, including a lot of oil and gas production, right? How a lot of these petrochemicals are made. So when we think about the paradigm of what's happening, some people call that progress. Some people celebrate that. And I'm open to sitting here and being convinced why this is a good idea. To this day, I mean, truly, like I remain open, but I have yet to be presented with a viewpoint that says that like this hyper masculine, technocratic, like worldview, which is really based in like the foundation of like kind of the scientific method, right? Which is how can we remove all possible variables to make it so that we can like repeat this thing over and over and over and over again. Well, what it requires is the destruction of the entirety of the rest of the ecology of the planet. You have to avoid the idea that it rains. You have to avoid the idea that there are blights, there are viruses, there are, locusts, there are, whatever it may be. And of course, it's a folly to think that we can continue doing this and that it's going to work. And you see it happening, right? And so now we're moving into the future of like, okay, we know, so like the logical extension of that agricultural system is that we know we have about 50 harvests left, according to the UN, which is a very conservative scientific body, before there will not be any topsoil left on this planet to grow food. We have 50 years. And it's probably less, right? And it's the result, yes, of maybe a few thousand years of agriculture, but in many ways, the last 150 years of agriculture are what has led us to this moment, right? And so if we think about that, we go, okay, we're here today. This is what we're doing. This is the petrochemical intensive industrial focus we have of this is how we're going to feed humanity. And we know we have 50 years left if we continue doing it this way. Then of course there's a bunch of, C-suite executives and scientists at the largest, petrochemical and agricultural and genetic companies in the world trying to figure out like how are we going to thread this needle while we maintain complete and total control over the cult of the seed, right? Which is exactly what they're trying to do. They want to maintain complete control over the seeds, the inputs, the tractors, the equipment, the petrochemicals, because, well, that's capitalism at work, right? We had briefly talked about this paradigm, but again, I think this is a good moment to talk about the paradigm, right? Where there's like the idea of like destructive practices. And then there's like the next layer would be like doing less harm, right? And then there's like doing good, right? So like we know that stealing land from indigenous people, clear cutting the land, and then drilling it for oil is like destructive practices, and then putting palm on it, right? Then there's like doing less harm, which is like, oh, we have like a rainforest certification, or whatever it is. We're only selectively logging this place, but we're actually ultimately destroying it. Then there's like the paradigm of doing good, which most mission-driven companies, including us, oftentimes spend a lot of time in this paradigm, which is like, oh, we're do whatever our version of doing good is. Like we have a view and we say, this is what we're going to spread. Oh, we're doing organic, so we're doing good. Oh, we're doing fair trade, so we're doing good. Oh, we're, reforesting, so we're doing good, right? And the movement from doing good to regenerative requires like a holistic understanding of like the living system of like all the pieces that are moving, because how do I say this? You have to, when it's done well, you have to fully step out of what you want, right? It no longer has anything to do with me being like, oh, I want to run a successful company, or oh, I want to produce, this much sacha inchi per acre. It's like, oh, like the living system dictates like this is its highest potential. And the only question is like, are you an instrument and a vehicle for this place, this culture, this ecosystem to reach its highest potential? If you're doing that, you're working regeneratively, right? You're working within the living systems framework of what it is. And sometimes we're successful at that and sometimes we're not. But, I would argue we spend a lot of time in the doing good paradigm.
He said that final phase, B, regenerative, requires a more holistic understanding that goes beyond what I want, beyond that individualistic perspective, and starts asking what the system needs. And such understanding takes a lifetime to gather. Here's what Aaron Gilliam, a grazing specialist who is doing active land restoration work in Sonoma County, had to say about that.
My name is Aaron Gilliam. I was born in San Francisco, California, and my family moved to Marin when I was 6. And so until I went off to college, I lived in Marin County.
Okay. And where did you go to school?
I went to college at University of California in Santa Barbara.
And you studied?
I got a Bachelor of Science in Environmental Studies, and my focus within that was stream ecology.
And so then how did you learn about the project that you're working on now? How did you end up there? Was this an opportunity that you were looking for specifically?
Kind of. I had moved up to Washington State and was living and working on a small ranch up there. And my good friend and collaborator in the past, Byron Palmer, had called me and said, "Hey, I know you got your whole new thing going on up in Washington, and I hope you're happy. But if by chance you were open to the opportunity to return to, the place you're from in California and work with a nonprofit doing the similar stuff you were doing before you left, but with this nonprofit subsidy, would you be open to that?" And it just so happened that because of the way things were going in Washington at that time, I was open to that. And he said that there was some new funding flowing into the nonprofit that he worked for that could get me hired to work on some new ranches in the San Antonio Valley, where I had lived for over a decade, and managed the land with livestock, and was very connected to socially with the social network there, and just had a lot of time on the ground in that ecology and a lot of care for it. Anyway, so that opportunity is what eventually brought me back to here, working for the Sonoma Mountain Institute, which is a nonprofit that basically subsidizes a semi-agricultural focused livestock operation in which we get to put far much more effort into our land stewardship than an average livestock operation would be able to do financially.
And what is the goal?
We would like to manage the livestock in a way that is mimicking of the historic patterns of grazing animals and the prey that would have been living with and following them. So we are the prey in that situation, in a way, like we're playing the role of moving these animals around, and our goal is to support as much diversity as we can, as much plant life diversity as we can, and support as much photosynthetic productivity on the land as we can. And so we're trying to improve the hydrology of the land. And our biggest tools, like say it's like a paintbrush. Like we have the paintbrush of a big cattle herd. We can put together 1,800 head of cattle and paint that across the land. And every time we pass through a paddock or down an alleyway or whatever it is, we are taking a paintbrush, and it's a different paintbrush in the spring versus in the winter versus in the summer. But our goal is improving the diversity and the productivity and the functionality of the ecosystems, the various ecosystems here that we're managing. And on top of that, another goal is that we're participating in the food, the food industry, the agricultural industry. So the goals have been there, but our tools are diversifying.
Okay.
And it's really hard to model exactly, to know how our efforts, what outcomes they will have. But I think that an underlying philosophy is that if we do different things on the land, there will be different responses from the land. So if we want diversity, we want a variety of different things happening, we can't just do one thing. We do one thing across a diversity of space, and we're going to get a certain amount of diversity in response. But if we do lots of different things, we're going to get, in theory, a lot of different responses, i.e. diversity. And we may not know exactly. The ecology is so complex. There's so many things happening, and we are pulling this lever and then that lever, and then we do two at the same time one year, and this year's a drought, next year's a flood. Like there's so many factors happening, like to model exactly what the best thing to do is really hard, and to know exactly the results. And we're constantly eyes wide open, and we take in a lot of data to help us see these patterns. But in the end, I think our larger efforts are just trying to do a diversity of things, hence diversifying the tools we're working with. I could pick up on patterns in other places, even though they're different, but really it does take a long time to dial in to a place, to be able to understand it well enough to not have a mentor teaching you something. Like if I were to move to Hawaii, really, it would take me years to understand the patterns there and the geology, and there's so much stuff that interacts. Without a mentor, it would take another lifetime.
That's one thing Ari and I are really hoping to kind of capture with this season, is that when we talk about regenerative ag, there's this mentorship that has happened in indigenous communities since basically the dawn of time. Okay, here is something to blow your mind. A teaspoon of healthy soil can contain more microorganisms than there are people on Earth.
What?
Yeah. Well,
I don't believe it.
I didn't either.
I do believe it.
I didn't either.
I do believe it, actually. I know the power of soil.
I did several "are you sure" queries into the Google machine to make sure that I could say that. But yeah, no, when we're talking about the different bacteria, fungi, protozoa, nematodes. It's literally an entire living ecosystem that is invisible to the naked eye that makes it possible for plants to grow, for nutrients to cycle, for carbon to be stored, for water to be absorbed. Like, there is so much happening in that literal teaspoon of soil.
Teaspoon.
Yeah. And healthy soil is not dirt. Like, dirt is what you get when the ecosystem, that tiny, tiny ecosystem that I just described, collapses.
I would also like to note that there is a literal definition, definitive difference between soil and dirt. Like, it by definition is not the same thing.
No.
Because of this, because when that ecosystem collapses, the soil to dirt it gets classified completely as something different.
Right. And that distinction between soil and dirt is not just semantic. It's actually the difference between land that can feed people and land that can't. Another sidebar to what if we get it right, there is an interview that Dr. Johnson does with a group of people who revitalized land that they were told could never grow anything ever again because what was left on the property was dirt. And with enough input and love and care, spoiler alert, they're growing stuff there. But anyways, once soil has degraded into dirt, like I just described, growing food without pumping in external inputs like fertilizers, pesticides, herbicides becomes next to impossible. You have to put something in because there is nothing there anymore. The biological foundation that made farming possible in the first place is gone. So
Poof.
So what does industrial agriculture do to soil?
Intensive tillage, which is the deep plowing that prepares ground for planting, physically disrupts soil structure. It breaks apart the fungal networks that connect plants underground, the ones that allow them to share nutrients and information. It exposes carbon stored in the soil to the atmosphere, turning farmland from a carbon sink into a carbon source. And we've spoken about this, I feel like ad nauseum. Maybe it hasn't all been recorded for Hotel Earth, but this is the thing I keep. This fact right here was kind of my launching point for wanting to understand the agricultural system better.
Yeah.
Because when I found out that due to the way we are currently growing food, excess carbon is being released into the atmosphere, where if we just change the system, we could literally keep carbon in the ground and we could reverse the effects of climate change. I was like, you've got to be joking. You've got to be joking. Anyways, monocropping drains specific nutrients without replenishment. When you grow the same crop in the same place, year after year after year, you pull the same things out of the soil over and over, and eventually there's nothing left to pull. So if throughout this season we continuously, talk shit, for lack of a better word, for monoculture and monocropping, that's why. Synthetic fertilizers provide plants with the chemical nutrients they need to grow, but they don't feed the soil ecosystem that Lexi was talking about. Instead, heavy fertilizer use can actually suppress the microbial communities that make soil naturally fertile. You get the crop, but you slowly kill what made the crop possible. Riddle me that logic. And here's where the numbers get really interesting. Research published in peer-reviewed journals estimates that nutrient levels in our food, everyone listening, have declined by as much as 80% in just the last 30 to 40 years, a direct consequence of soil degradation. What does that mean? That means that 30 to 40 years ago, an orange had 400% more vitamins and nutrients than it does now. We have lost 80% of nutrient count from our food in this short amount of time. We are growing more food and it's literally feeding us less. 1/3 of the world's soil is currently classified as moderately or highly degraded. The United Nations has warned that if current trends continue, 90% of soils could be degraded by 2050.
Grace Johnson, an urban farmer and educator we spoke with, made this beautifully concrete. She talked about compost, right? It's not just as like a nice hobby, but it's a literal tool for bringing life back into what, I don't want to call it dead ground, but ground that doesn't have the life that it once did. So call that what you will. It reintroduces microorganisms. It rebuilds the biological infrastructure that makes growth in plants possible. It makes it so that those synthetic inputs are not needed. And mind you, compost technically still is an input, right? Like you're taking something that is not soil and putting it into, I guess, what is now dirt, but still. Anyways, rebuilding the biological infrastructure is slow work. It's not glamorous, but it is actually the kind of work that changes things.
I'm sure that in your work, whether at school or at the many different places that you've worked at and steward, have you seen examples of farms or just like land generally transitioning from degraded soil to what we would like consider healthier soil?
Yes, absolutely. I've seen soil that basically is dirt, and the definitional difference, as I'm sure you might have explained by now or at this point, would be that dirt is typically used to describe not living soil. It's soil that has kind of been degraded and is now just dust versus soil which is alive and full of nutrients and little fauna and all that good stuff. And so I've seen soil that was pretty much just dust, mostly sand, maybe a little bit of clay. And once all this humus and compost was added, you see that it just like comes alive and relatively quickly. It takes time, but relatively quickly you can see that water infiltration, you can see the soil aggregates, you can see just life and like running around in it, and it it's beautiful. It's so cool.
So there's also a water story here, and it's inseparable from the soil story. Healthy soil acts like a sponge. It absorbs rainfall, it holds it, it releases it slowly, which recharges groundwater, it feeds streams, and it prevents runoff, where degraded soil does the opposite. Water runs off the surface, taking topsoil with it, flooding waterways, and leaving the land drier than before. It also can take other contaminants and pollutants that it's picking up along the way and transport that directly into our waterways, which is a really big problem with like stormwater runoff and also different agricultural outfits that maybe use things that are not so nice for the environment that shouldn't be going into the waterway. They can actually the rain can collect those things and then transport it directly into rivers, streams, lakes, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But anyway, so in a state like California, where water is increasingly precious and drought is increasingly severe, this is not an abstract concern. Regenerative practices that rebuild soil structure have shown to dramatically improve water infiltration and retention. Aaron, who you heard from at the beginning of the episode, talked about what riparian repair actually looks like on the ground, which helps to restore the vegetation along waterways and reintroduces the ecological relationships that keep water in the landscape. It is painstaking, multi-year work, but it's working.
Getting into the riparian zones, these like super important components of our ecosystems where...
Can you explain what a riparian zone is?
Yeah, a riparian zone is the zone around a waterway, and those waterways include, inline ponds and out of the waterline ponds, but mostly creeks and rivers, and the zone around them that is characterized by the like water dependent plant life is called the riparian zone. So those zones are really productive because they enjoy the benefit of being at the part of the water table that gets water and during the summer here. So it stands out. It's green in the summer. It's where it's cooler. It's where a lot of animals are going to go for their drinking and for their lush green, highly nutritious plant life to eat. So they draw in animals, and the management of those zones, of those highly productive zones, is it's a focal point of ours. So we can do other things like fence them out, give them more rest. We manage the influences of our disturbance, a la grazing. It's very focused around the riparian zones. We also can get in there and we plant stuff. And we can manage the physical aspects of those riparian zones to help slow the water down in ways that supports the growth of those riparian plants, and hopefully, from a watershed perspective, is improving the hydrology by working in those zones. So we do stuff there too.
All right, folks, so today we've given you all a sort of reality check on what's going on in industrial agriculture, the industry that the world is dependent on. We've explained the benefits of it, but we also revealed a not-so-cute side, the side that demonstrates why we can't keep growing our food that way, the decrease in nutritional value of our food, the destruction of topsoil that in turn will prohibit us from growing more food, and the impact on the climate and environment. It's pretty bleak, to say the least.
Throughout this episode, we've mentioned regenerative agriculture quite a bit, and it's a part of the path forward to real change in our agriculture system, but it's not the only piece to this puzzle. Tune in next week for an in-depth conversation about regenerative agriculture, what it means, what it can do for us, and what needs to happen alongside it in order for the paradigm shift to happen. As we said at the top of this episode, regenerative agriculture alone isn't going to solve all of our farming problems. Hoteler 360 is written and produced by Ariana Halvai and Alexandria Moorhead, with contributions from Perry Kaler, but could not have been possible without the profound shared knowledge of Indigenous communities. This episode was edited by Ariana Halvai. Find us on Substack at hoteler360.com, YouTube, and wherever you listen to your podcasts.